I never imagined that a quiet evening at home, sipping tea while waiting for my husband, would send my life spiraling in a direction I couldn't have predicted. But that's the thing about life, it loves to toss surprises your way when you're least prepared. My name is Rachel, and I'm 48 years old. I've been married to a great guy named Daniel for almost 25 years. We've built a comfortable life together, one filled with routines, shared memories, and a love that's grown deeper over time. Daniel works as a senior manager at a well-known company, and while he often shares stories from the office, I never paid much attention, until recently. It all started with a casual remark he made over dinner one night. "You wouldn't believe the day I had," Daniel said, loosening his tie as he sat across from me. "Nathan pulled off something unbelievable today. The whole office is still buzzing about it." I raised an eyebrow. Nathan. I'd heard his name before. He was one of Daniel's closest colleagues, a guy in his early 40s who joined the company a few years back. Daniel always spoke highly of him, smart, ambitious, charming, and well-liked by everyone. "What happened?" I asked, curious. Daniel leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. He stood up to the regional director in the middle of a meeting. Told him flat out that he was wrong about the new restructuring plan. And the crazy part? He had the numbers to back it up. He practically saved the entire department from disaster. I took a sip of my tea, impressed. "That's bold." "It was more than bold," Daniel said, admiration clear in his voice. "It was gutsy." No one else dared to speak up, but Nathan just laid it all out there. I have to say, I respect the guy even more now. I'd never met Nathan in person, but hearing Daniel talk about him with such enthusiasm sparked my curiosity. I pictured him as someone confident, unshakable, and sure of himself, a man who didn't hesitate to stand his ground. And for the first time in years, the words came out quieter than I meant them to. Nathan didn't stop me. He just nodded, like he knew I needed to walk away, but also like he knew I'd be replaying that conversation in my head long after I left. And he was right. That evening, I went through my usual routine, cooking dinner, setting the table, listening to Daniel talk about his day. But my mind kept drifting back to the moment in the office, the way Nathan had looked at me, the quiet intensity in his voice. I felt guilty for thinking about it, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the realization his words had sparked in me. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, I stared at the ceiling, wide awake. He stirred slightly, turning toward me. "You okay?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Yeah," I whispered. "Just thinking." He made a small noise of acknowledgement before drifting back into sleep, completely unaware of the thoughts racing through my mind. Over the next few days, I tried to push the moment with Nathan aside. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Daniel had another late-night meeting, and instead of going home alone, I decided to stop by the cafe near his office, one of my favorite places to sit and unwind. It was quieter in the evenings, the soft hum of conversations mixing with the smell of coffee and warm pastries. I had just settled into a corner booth when I heard a familiar voice. "Rachel." I looked up, my breath catching slightly. Nathan stood there, a takeaway cup in his hand, looking surprised but pleased to see me. "What are the odds?" I said, managing a small smile. He chuckled. "Either fate or just the reality of working too late and needing caffeine." He gestured toward the empty seat across from me. "Mind if I sit?" I hesitated, but only for a second. "Sure." He sat down, setting his cup on the table. "How have you been?" I shrugged, stirring my tea absent-mindedly. "Busy. The usual." Nathan watched me for a moment before leaning slightly forward. "And how are you, really?" Something in the way he asked made me feel like he already knew the answer. I let out a small breath, glancing out the window as I spoke. "I don't know. I guess I've just been thinking about." I hesitated, but then the words just came out. "About what you said in the office." Nathan didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked like he'd been expecting me to say that. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I said it out loud. "I don't know if I've been truly seen in a long time." The words hung between us, heavy and real. Nathan's expression softened. "That's not something you should have to wonder about, Rachel." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "It's not that Daniel doesn't love me," I added quickly. "I know he does. We've built a life together, a family, memories. But somewhere along the way, I think I became more of a fixture in his world rather than someone he really notices." Nathan didn't rush to respond. Instead, he let the words settle before speaking. "I think that happens to a lot of people," he said gently. "But it doesn't mean you have to accept it." I looked down at my hands, my heart pounding. I shouldn't be having this conversation. I shouldn't be feeling this. But I did. I took a deep breath, forcing a small smile. You ask a lot of dangerous questions, Nathan. He smiled, but there was something serious in his eyes. I don't think they're dangerous. I think they're necessary. I glanced at the time and realized how late it had gotten. I should go. Nathan nodded but didn't move right away. He just watched me, as if trying to read something in my expression. Take care, Rachel, he said finally. I nodded, grabbed my bag, and walked out into the night air. But as I drove home, my hands gripping the wheel, I knew something had shifted. Nathan had given voice to something I hadn't even admitted to myself, and now that it was out in the open, I wasn't sure if I could ignore it anymore. The night air was cool against my skin as I drove home, but inside, I felt warm, almost feverish. My thoughts swirled, tangled in emotions I wasn't ready to name. I told myself that Nathan was just a colleague, a kind man, a friend who had simply asked the right questions at the right time. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he listened, truly listened, in a way that felt rare. It made me realize how long it had been since I'd felt that kind of attention. And now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day at the office, I told myself I'd act normal, that I'd put last night behind me. I lasted all of 20 minutes. Because the moment I saw Nathan by the break room, his sleeves rolled up, a coffee in hand, my stomach tightened. He wasn't doing anything special, just standing there talking to another coworker, but my body reacted before my brain could remind me to be rational. He glanced up, caught my eye, and there it was again, that quiet intensity, that silent questioning in his gaze. I quickly looked away and hurried to my desk, willing my heart to slow down. I needed distance. And yet, later that afternoon, I found myself walking toward his office, a file in hand, an excuse, a reason to talk to him. I knocked lightly, and he looked up from his computer. Rachel, his voice was warm, almost expectant. I hesitated, gripping the file a little too tightly. I have those reports you needed. A slow smile tugged at his lips, like he saw right through me. Come in. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The office was quiet, the faint hum of the city outside the window the only sound between us. Nathan leaned back in his chair, watching me. Is that really why you came? I opened my mouth to say yes, but the words didn't come out. Instead, I exhaled and sank into the chair across from him. I don't know why I'm here, I admitted. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. I think you do. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. I could feel my pulse in my throat, a steady drumbeat against the silence. I don't know what this is, I finally whispered. Nathan leaned forward slightly. It doesn't have to be anything. Not if you don't want it to be. And yet, it already was. The way I felt around him, the way my heart raced, the way my thoughts lingered on him long after I left his presence, it was something. A something that scared me. I'm married, I said. He nodded, his gaze never leaving mine. I know. I let out a shaky breath. Then why does this feel like a line I'm about to cross? Nathan was quiet for a long moment, then he said, because maybe it's a line that needed to be noticed before it was crossed. I swallowed hard. What does that even mean? He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his desk. It means maybe this isn't about me. Maybe it's about you finally seeing what's been missing. His words struck something deep inside me because he was right. This wasn't about Nathan. It was about me. For so long, I had moved through my life without questioning, without feeling the way I was feeling now. I had been comfortable, but comfort wasn't the same as being fulfilled. And now, I couldn't unsee it. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor as I pushed it back with more force than I intended. The sudden movement felt like a break from the tension that had been building between us, but it didn't offer any relief. I didn't know how to end this, but I knew I couldn't stay. I should go, I said, the words feeling foreign as they left my mouth, almost like they weren't mine to speak. Nathan didn't try to stop me. He didn't reach out or offer any comfort, which in itself was a kind of response. He simply nodded, his face unreadable, as though he had expected this moment and had already prepared for it. Take care, Rachel, he said, his voice low and steady, but there was something in it, something that lingered in the silence that followed. I turned without another word, the door clicking shut behind me with a finality that felt almost too loud. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest with a heavy rhythm that refused to settle. I could feel the gravity of what had just transpired, but even as I walked away, I knew it wasn't over. Something had shifted between us, something unsaid, something neither of us could ignore. A line had been crossed, and once that happens, there's no going back. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur, each hour blending into the next as I busied myself with meaningless tasks. I avoided Nathan, steering clear of his calls and messages, throwing myself into my work like it was the only thing that mattered. I answered emails with a false enthusiasm, engaging in small talk with coworkers about trivial things that had no significance to me. I was desperately trying to drown out the maelstrom of thoughts swirling in my mind, but no matter how hard I tried, they wouldn't be silenced. The thing about unspoken truths is that they always come to the surface eventually. No matter how much you try to suppress them, they find a way to demand attention. By the time I was driving home, I was physically drained, but it was the emotional exhaustion that weighed on me the most, the kind of tired that goes beyond just needing rest. It was a deep soul weariness, like I had been carrying a burden I didn't know I had. And the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't just questioning my marriage. I was questioning everything about myself, choices I had made, paths I had taken. I thought I had been certain of who I was, of what my life was supposed to be, but now I wasn't so sure anymore. The doubts, the uncertainty, they weren't just swirling around the situation with Nathan. They were about me. About everything that had led me to this point. And that realization, heavy and suffocating, settled deep in my chest. That night, I sat across from Daniel at the dinner table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting long shadows over our quiet home. The only sound was the muted clinking of silverware against our plates, a rhythm we had both become so accustomed to over the years. This house, our home, had been the backdrop to countless meals, countless conversations, and countless moments shared between us. We had lived here for 20 years, built a life together. Yet, for the first time in a long time, as I sat there across from him, it felt as though I was sitting face to face with a complete stranger. Daniel, as usual, seemed lost in his own world, his focus entirely on the food in front of him. Without lifting his eyes, he muttered, "Long day." I paused before answering, my fingers tightening around the handle of my fork. My throat felt tight, as if the question I wanted to ask had lodged itself somewhere deep inside me, unwilling to leave until I spoke it out loud. "Yeah," I finally replied, my voice flat, detached. He gave a casual shrug, not seeming to notice the shift in the air around us. "Same as usual. Same as usual." Those words, it was such a simple, innocent phrase, but in that moment, they hit me like a weight settling in my chest with a heaviness that threatened to suffocate me. Because in those words, I heard the truth, clear and undeniable. That's exactly what our marriage had become, the usual. A series of predictable, unremarkable days blending seamlessly into nights with no real moments of connection, no real conversations, just the surface-level pleasantries we had been repeating for years, like a well-worn script neither of us had the energy or the will to change. I set my fork down slowly, my fingers numb against the cool metal. I looked at him, the man I had once known so intimately, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the distance between us. The gap that had slowly, silently widened over the years until we were nothing more than two people coexisting under the same roof. "Daniel," I said, my voice quieter now but heavier, full of something I couldn't quite name. At the sound of my voice, Daniel finally looked up from his plate. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of confusion in them. It wasn't the first time I'd asked myself whether he truly saw me anymore, whether he even really noticed me. But tonight, it felt different. My question lingered in the air, demanding an answer. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to steady the storm inside me. "Are you happy?" His frown deepened, and he set down his fork, his gaze shifting as if he wasn't sure he had heard me correctly. "What do you mean?" I said slowly, struggling to find the right words. "Are you happy with us? With this life we built together?" He blinked, his expression softening into something I couldn't quite place. Confusion, surprise, maybe both. "Where is this coming from?" he asked, clearly caught off guard by my sudden vulnerability. I let out a soft sigh, feeling the weight of my own uncertainty. "I don't know," I admitted quietly, my voice trembling slightly. I feel like we've stopped seeing each other. Like we're just going through the motions without ever really connecting anymore." For a long moment, he didn't speak. His jaw tightened, and I saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes, the familiar impulse to shut down and brush past the discomfort. I had seen it before, 100 times, and part of me braced myself for the same old response, the quick dismissal, the change of subject. But instead, there was a subtle shift in his expression. Something softened just a little in the way he looked at me. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if, just for a moment, he was truly hearing me. "I guess I always thought that this is just how things go after a certain point in life," he said softly, his voice laced with a quiet sadness. "You get comfortable. You settle into a rhythm. You build something solid. You stop searching for something new because, somewhere along the way, you start to believe that what you found is all there is, all you need." The words hung in the air, heavy like a fog that settled over my chest. I swallowed hard, trying to push past the lump that had formed in my throat, but it was hard to shake off the weight of it all. "And do you honestly think that's enough?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, unsure of whether I was asking him or myself. Daniel fell into a long silence, the kind of silence that felt like it was drawing all the air from the room. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face as though trying to erase the weight of our conversation. "Rachel," he said, his voice cautious, as though he already sensed the depth of what I was holding back. "Is there something you're trying to tell me?" I froze. This was the moment where I could lay everything out on the table, confess the things I'd been too scared to say. I could tell him about Nathan, about how he had made me feel alive in ways I hadn't felt in years, about how he had made me question everything I thought I knew, about how, for the first time in a long time, I had wondered if what we had built together, was enough. But instead of speaking those words, I held them in. Because this moment wasn't really about Nathan. It was about us. It was about what had quietly been slipping away without either of us noticing. I reached for Daniel's hand, my fingers brushing against his. The familiar warmth of his skin against mine was a lifeline, grounding me in this moment. "I just don't want us to fall into the trap of routine," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to wake up one day years from now and realize we've been living next to each other but not really with each other. I don't want to wake up and find out we've let all this slip away because we were too busy just existing." His hand tightened around mine, the pressure both comforting and steady. For a moment, I could feel the weight of his gaze, but I didn't dare look up. I didn't need to see his face to know that he understood, that he felt the same pull of something more than what we had settled into. "Me neither," he said, his voice barely audible, but the sincerity in his words cut through the space between us. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a sweeping confession or some perfect resolution to all the unspoken things that had been building for months. It was simpler than that. It was just a beginning, a small shift in the direction we were headed. And as I sat there, feeling the warmth of his hand in mine, I realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, we had taken a step toward finding our way back to each other. The next morning at work, I passed by Nathan's office. He looked up, and our eyes met for a brief moment. This time, I didn't stop. I just gave him a small, knowing smile and kept walking. Because I knew now, this was never about him. It was about me. And for the first time in years, I was finally ready to start figuring out who I really was.